Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little older than most maps. The long layered story of Palestine. From ancient Canaanite hilltops and olive grove to the tangled streets and headlines of today. Forget the glossy postcards and tidy epics. Beneath those olive branches and weathered stones lies a history of shifting empires, stubborn daily lives, and the relentless work of surviving through change. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a day in many of those moments, whether facing erratic harvests, the pressures of foreign rule, or the sudden ruptures that have defined the modern era. Life here across centuries was often a continuous test. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications. Take a deep breath. And let's begin. By the 3rd millennium B.C. long before modern maps would name the place Palestine, a string of tells, low sun-baked mounds of inhabited earth, rose like beads along the Levantine coast and up into the inland hills. And in those mounds, the first urban experiment of Canaan took shape. Hazor on the upper Jordan plain, Medigo guarding a leash of trade routes and water, Jericho pressed against its spring like a secret. Cities here were not the anonym Israeli rations of later industrial age. They were carefully organized machines of storage, ritual, and commerce, each one a city-state ruled by a palace and a temple that together kept accounts, controlled grain, and park, laid out favors and punishments. You can still image, if you let your mind wander in that slow, attentive way, the smell of olive oil, the tang of dried fish, cedar beams being hoisted, the metallic glint of bronze as a smith hammered it hot, the ordinary logistics that built durable power, grain granaries, courtyards where workers needed dough, storerooms that held jars stamped with the seal of a lord. The Bronze Age in this literal arc. The early Bronze scene of 33 million, 2000 B.C.E. The Middle Bronze scene 200 to 1550 B.C.E. The Late Bronze say 1550. 1200 B.C.I. was a period of integration as much as local invention. Cities like Byblo and Tai to the north traded cedar with Egypt. Ugarit on the northern Syrian coast kept vaults of cuneiform for letters and ritual texts that have since become lanterns for our understanding of Canaanite religion. Ebla's tablets stored of commerce with inland markets and the copper of Cyprus under the name Alicia in Near Eastern correspondence flowed into workshops that fashioned the bronze of weapons and tools. The great logistical challenge of the age was the making unmoving of bronze itself. Tin was rarer than copper and had to be drawn across long, sometimes perilous chains of exchange from Anatolia or farther east, and those chains connected to the Levant to a Bronze Age world stretching from Mesopotamia to the Aeon. Control of a pass, a spring or a coastal anchorage could determine which city prospered and which faded. Politically, the landscape was one of city-states rather than empires. Hazor in the north was the largest and most elaborate of them during the Late Bronze Age. Medigos ride the Via Maris, a kind of ancient highway for chariots and caravans, and Jericho, a far older settlement, retained a presence into the Bronze Age through control of its perennial spring. These cities were linked in an economy of reciprocity and obligation. Palaces and temples sponsored craftsmen and scribes. Seal impressions and cylinder seals traced ownership, and scribes kept holes in cuneiform for more local scripts, sending messages to a distant pharaoh when necessary. That distant pharaoh more often than not during the Late Bronze Age thought of Canaan as a network of vassal states rather than a foreign country to be annexed. The Amana letters of the 14th century BCE clay tablets from the court of Akan are an extraordinary survival. Local rulers like Abdihar of Jerusalem and Morlabaya of Shek-Ch wrote pleading letters to the Egyptian king begging for aid, complaining about neighbors and robbers and confessing the thinness of their hold on power. These letters reveal in a very human register how fragile political authority could be when supply lines frayed, or when one city's coalition shifted. Religion and ritual bound communities as literally as walls. In shrine and temple, the Canaanite pantheon reigned. El the elder god like a kindly patriarch, Baal the storm lord whose annual victory brought rain and fertility, and at the fierce warrior goddess, Usher perhaps as a motherly consort, and their images and votive offerings were everywhere. Small carved ivories, terra-cotta figurines, altars tucked beside houses, but worship here was intimate and local, as well as public. Household shrines sat among the four-room houses that would later become emblematic of Israelite domestic architecture, and worship wasn't yet monopolized by a single temple or a single text. Priesthoodess interlaced with palatial power and with merchant household. Temples were both economic centers and sacred spaces, controlling land and personnel and receiving tribute in oil and grain and textiles, just as much as in prayers. Material culture spoke across borders. Canaanite craftsmen excelled at inlay and ivory work, at producing storage jars stamped with merchant marks, at painting pottery that echoed Aeon forms and Egyptian motifs. The coastal cities participated in a maritime economy that ran down the coastline to Egypt and across to Cyprus and the Aeon. The Levantine shore was a stage for exchanging goods and ideas, and that exchange left marks Egyptian scarabs in Medigo, Minian pottery in the south, Anatolian seals in inland sites. The alphabet itself, a modest but revolutionary technology, GE stated here in Proto-Anite scripts in the 2nd millennium BCE, simplifying the complex ununiformed hieroglyphic systems into a linear system that would in later centuries make writing more portable, untradeable. Literacy then was a logistical advantage as much as a cultural one. This richness also contained a vulnerability. From roughly the 13th into the 12th century B.C., a profound upheaval rippled across the eastern Mediterranean and through Ki the so called Late Bronze Age collapse. Palatial states in Anatolia and the Aeon faltered. The Hittite Empire evaporated. Mycenaean centers burned and were abandoned. Trade networks all aid. Egyptian texts across the century mention the Sea Peoples, a mottled-like collection of maritime attackers who in the inscriptions of Ramesses II around 1177 B.C. are depicted in dramatic relief as halting the coasts and being repelled by the pharaoh. Had Ram Arten the Levantine literals showed destruction layers in many tales. A handful of cities were at or reduced, yet the archaeological truth is mixture rather than a single catastrophe. Some places like Tyre and Sidon maintained continuity. Some sites show abrupt breakage, while others show transformation. Pottery styles shift. Administrative centers shrink. New groups appear in the archaeological record, and people in the highlands increase settlement. Scholars argue, one camps these collapsed into palace economies and long distant exchange. A dark age of contraction. Another sees resilience, adaptation to new political realities, local powers filling the vacuum, the building of a different kind of social order, less palace and more village, but still vibrant. Both are true to an extent. The slow porous processes of migration, conflict toward rout, and economic stress combined then, as they always do, to rearrange a social map. Out of that rearrangement, in the centuries that followed, new polities and T's began to coh here. The term Iron Age way, 1200 to 1000 B.C., marks not a moment of divine intervention, but a set of pragmatic material changes, the replacement of bronze by iron where it made sense, villages in the central highlands consolidating into denser settlement patterns, coastal plains hosting fresh faces, the Philistines whose pottery and architecture carry a Nile imprint. The Philistines settled in a compact group of coastal cities, Gaza Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Geth, developed what archaeologists call a pent-apoulos. Their ports and their tastes connected them to Cyprus and the Aegean. Their pottery, the distinctive big chromeware, speaks of movement and cultural transplantation. Strategically, they were in a prime position to control maritime trade and to influence the grain-rich plains behind them. They were, from the viewpoint of the emerging highland communities, formidable neighbors. The people whom later texts call Israelites seem to have coalesced in the highlands of the central hill country, not in a dramatic single invasion, but through a process of ethnogenesis that involved local Canaanite populations, pastoral groups, and immigrant elements. The man-pastille carved by the Egyptian pharaoh Manp around 1208 BCE is the first extra-biblical reference to Israel. Israel is wasted, its seed no more, and it implies a recognizable social unit in the late 13th century. Archaeology shows that the highland settlements of the Iron Age were often small, agrarian, and relatively egalitarian in their material culture. Their houses were clustered along ridge-tipped terraces, their pottery simple and functional, their economic life organized around cereals, olives, and vines. The logistics of survival here were local: water capture, terracing, rotational grazing, and tight social controls on land. But where logistical efficiency met opportunity, leaders emerged who could marshal labor, fortify a site, and craft coalitions. The narrative of kingship that follows in the Hebrew Bible. Saul the Urstwl warrior from JIA, often dated c. 1050 to 1010 BCE. David, folk hero and consolidator, seen as 1010 to 970 BCE. Solomon, the builder king, associated with monumental works in a centralized court, seen 970 to 931 BC, is both memory and political program. Archaeology tests and tempers the tale. The claims of a united monarchy that controlled a vast S-wave of territory in the 10th century are debated. Some excavations reveal impressive constructions at sites like Megiddo, Hazor, and Giza, and the biblical tradition famously credits Solomon with building their gates. Yet chronology is a slippery thing. Some scholars following different stratigraphic and radiogram analyses argue that those monumental phases better fit the 9th century and the Omride expansion, not the 10th. Israel Finkelstein and others propose a low chronology that shifts much 10th century grandeur into the 9th century, arguing that David and Solomon's kingdom, while real, may have been smaller than the received epic suggests. Other archaeologists point to bright, if sparse, evidence urbanization and fortification that could belong to a 10th century polity. Teld and Steel, an Aramaic inscription from the 9th century that mentions the house of David, complicates the skeptic's calculus. It is not proof of Solomon's palaces, but it is a whisper of a dynastic memory. If we step back from dynastic claims and listen to the logistics, a plausible picture forms. In the highlands, some leaders increasingly organized the collection of grain and oil, coordinated the construction of defensive walls and watches, and negotiated the peace, politics of trade with coastal cities and inland caravans. Jerusalem, a modest but strategically placed hill town, came to host a palace and a temple complex in the memories and perhaps in the archaeology of the 10th century. And Davidic rhetoric would place the cultic center there. Centralization required manpower. It required the co-RV system, forced labor or paid labor, storage barns, and control of trade routes like the coastal via Arasan, the inland king's highway. Solomon's attributed works, dates, stables, caravanserai projects. A house of the Forest of Lebanon read like a logistics manual for running a small empire. Secure the roads, control the passes, tax the traders, and the rest becomes administratively possible. Whether all this occurred on scale, the biblical account suggests, remains a matter of debate, but the strategic logic is clear. Political fragmentation followed the death of Solomon. Around 931 BCE, the kingdom purportedly split. The northern 10 tribes formed the kingdom known as Israel, with its capitals rotating through places like Shech-Ch and later Samaria under Om, Oycats 873 BCE, while the southern kingdom, Judah, remained oriented on Jerusalem. Israel, with richer agricultural tracts and more urban centers, oft unfielded greater wealth and talent, but also courted more enemies. Its rulers Ahab and others built palaces and courtyards, engaged in diplomatic marriage with Phoenician houses. Ahab famously married Jezebel of Tyre and sometimes adopted cosmopolitan practices that jarred with harsher prophetic critiques. Judah, more conservative and smaller, preserved a kind of hinted land identity that would later prove both resilient and vulnerable. The Iron Age was not only dynasties and diplomacy, it was also religious invention and reformation. Judaism gradually consolidated from a regional cult into a more exclusive devotion traced in scripture. Yet the archaeology and inscription suggests in Crete Sem long persisted. A share of figurines and cultic installations appear across Levantine sites. A votive inscription at Adrid, in the Sinai foothills dated to the 8th century, twice speaks enigmatically of Yahweh and his Asher, a phrase that some read as indicating a consort Minos-like figure attached to Yahweh's cult. The push toward exclusive worship of Yahweh was as much political as theological. Central kingship, prophetic critique, and social recalibration combined to valorize a single god in the complex religious marketplace of the Levant. Prophetic figures emerged to contest royal and priestly abuses. Amos and Hosea were railing at social injustice in the north, Isaiah in the south, prophesying courtly vision, and these voices shaped what would later be written down, edited, and argued about as canonical scripture. The Philistines conceived to be a fawn and a mirror to Israel and Judah, adept at seafaring, metallurgy and derb and craft. Their cities were fortified and cosmopolitan, producing fine metalwork and integrating both maritime trade goods and inland cereals. When iron began to take over from bronze for many uses, its relative abundance in the Near East shaped military advantage, and the Philistines' early mastering of iron technology gave them an edge in several confrontations. We tend to remember stories for their human drama, Samson's hair, David and Goliath, but the deeper facts are sober: steel and supply lines, control of forges and water, and the movement of mercenaries and slave labor. If the first half of the first millennium BCE in the southern Levant reads like a drama of local kingdoms testing their way against one another, the second half reads as imperial pressure and accommodation. The great imperial machinery to the north and east, Assyria in the 9th through 7th centuries BCE, had different logistics altogether, where Canaanite rulers managed granaries and the Syrian kings mastered iron armies, standardized siege craft, a network of roads and way stations, and a ruthless population policy. Tiglath-Pileser reigned 745 to 727 BCE, reorganized the imperial administration, and tightened control over the Levant, setting the stage for a century of Assyrian hegemony. He did not only conquer, he restructured. Provinces were created, vassal rulers were installed or deposed, tribute flows were regularized, and deportation increasingly became official policy. Deportation was awful and efficient. Move the elites and artisans who could have meant revolt. Scatter peasant populations to break their social cohesion. Replace them with foreigners loyal to the empire, and you reduce the risk of insurrection. The Assyrian state emphasized logistical predictability, roads to move troops, magazines to store supplies, and a bureaucratic chain of command that could extract grain from the Levantine field and send back silver and timber and men. This policy had direct and devastating consequences for the northern kingdom. After a long period of intermittent conflict, The northern kingdom of Israel fell in 722 B.C.I. under the pressure of Assyrian campaigns, led first by Shalom of 5 and claimed as consummate D by Sargon the Samaria fell. The northern elites were deported en masse. The polity, as it had been dissolved in the imperial garrison, set up a new provincial administration. The biblical cry about the 10 lost tribes echoes this momentum. The population transfers typical of Assyrian strategy produced mixed demographic results. New peoples were settled in the conquered territory. Syncretic cultural mixes emerged. But the disappearance of Israel as a sovereign entity was real and consequential. Judah fared differently, surviving as a vassal state for a time by paying tribute and by political prudence that sometimes slid into capitulation. The king Ahaz in the mid-8th century bowed to Tiglath-Pileser's iron later kings, paid what was necessary to keep the imperial clockwork from grinding their cities into dust. But VASGI had a cost. The century tested the strategic nerve of Judah's rulers. Hezekiah c. 715 to 600 Itexus B. CE reforming figure in Judah's memory tried to throw off Assyrian yoke. His preparations were logistical and practical. He fortified Jerusalem, diverted water into the city through the famous Siloam Tunnel project and shored up alliances. Sen, the Karibi Bey, the Assyrian king, reacted in 701 B.C.E. He laid waste to many Judean towns. Lachish's fall is memorialized in stone reliefs that once lined the walls of Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, showing siege ramps, archers, and captives, and he boasted that Hezekiah shut up in Jerusalem like a bird. Jerusalem, though, did not fall to Saharabi. The imperial record and the Judean narrative offer different spins on the episode. The Assyrian prism lists tribute taken from Hezekiah. The biblical account narrates a miraculous deliverance. Logistics matter more than miracles in the historian's ledger. Sennacherib's campaign overreached his capacity to sustain a prolonged siege in Jerusalem's tricky topography without incurring unsustainable losses elsewhere. Assyria's own center would not last forever. In the face of rising Babylonian power and coalition warfare, Nineveh fell in 12 B.C. and the Assyrian system fragmented. Into that vacuum stepped Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar's South II, reigned 605 to 560 to B.C.E. CI ruler with imperial ambition and a reputation for disciplined armies and spectacular building projects. Babylonian interest in the Levant was no abstract thing. It had strategic and official ration. Control of Judean lands meant control of tribute, coastal access, and of the grain and timber those lands could produce. Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns in the early 6th century culminated in a series of sieges and deportations that would change the face of Judah. The mechanics of Babylonian conquest had a pattern. A punitive campaign aimed at extracting compliance, followed by deportations that targeted the elites, the royal family, nobles, priests, chief artisans, and scribes were settled into Mesopotamia, where they could be watched, employed, and sometimes co-opted into imperial administration. In 597 BC, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, was taken captive to Babylon in the wake of a siege. A decade later, in 587 Itexus B.C.E., after a rebellion by Zedekiah and the stubborn refusal to submit, Nebuchadnezzar returned and Jerusalem was besieged again. This time the result was catastrophic in a different register. The city and Solomon's temple were destroyed. Large segments of the population were deported and the cultic heart of the polity was dismantled. The Babylonians were not iconoclasts for the sake of piety. They were purposeful. Destroying the temple symbolized a transfer of sovereignty and the end of a political order that relied on cultic legitimacy. What followed was not merely demographic dislocation, but a long intellectual and institutional response. Exile had a theological echo. Leaders, priests, and prophets who had been uprooted found themselves in Babylon rather than in Jerusalem, and the problem of identity demanded new solutions. With the temple gone, religion needed portable forms. Practices and laws began to be written and systematized in ways that travel could not easily erase. Prophets like Ezekiel, who prophesied in Babylon, reinterpreted disaster as a moral and theological reckoning. Exile was punishment, but also as a prelude to purification and return. Jeremiah, who had been active before and during the early years of exile, urged submission to Babylon as the will of God in one register and lamented betrayal and ruin in another. In Babylon, communities of Judean exiles clustered. They sent back memories, praise, laments, and perhaps text that would later form the skeleton of scriptural collections, the codification of worship, law, and narrative, the Deuteronomistic histories, editing of earlier traditions. Priestly materials gained urgency when symbols like the temple could no longer fully bind the people to a place. This administrative shock had cultural consequences. To the deported elites were sometimes placed in districts where their skills served the imperial economy. Craftsmen and scribes could find work in Babylonian building projects, and some rose to positions of responsibility. Yet their presence, they planted seeds of a diaspora. Communities of Judeans who would persist on foreign soil, maintaining identity through memory, ritual, and law. The diaspora was not only a dispersal, it was an incubator of new identity forms. When later Persian rulers would allow or encourage returns to the old land, those returning would bring with them strengthened textual traditions and a reconfigured priesthood. Those who remained formed the kernel of Jewish life beyond Palestine. Adaptable and textually anchored, there was also within the land itself a residual population, the poor, the agricultural masses who had not been deported, and other peoples who never left. These people of the land kept fuel, maintained villages, and under imperial oversight or local governors, scrambled to survive. Their continuity matters historically because social memory is not only compiled in courts and palaces, but lived in fields and kitchens. The demographic and social alterations set into motion by Assyrian and Babylonian policies created a pall impasse of memories, claims of ancestral land, the continuous presence of scattered groups, and the administrative imprint of foreign empires. The long-term consequences of these centuries are both practical and metaphysical. Practically, imperial strategies such as deportation and provincial governance reworked demographics and made the Levant mosaic of peoples. Economically and logistically, the region was folded more tightly into imperial circuits. Roads, taxes, and labor all ran along new patterns. Culturally, the trauma and displacement accelerated processes of textualization and institutionalization. Religion became more portable, authority more textual, and identity more reliant on written law and collective memory than on a single temple alone. The theological motifs that would shape later Judaism, covenant, exile as punishment, and purgation, hope for return, began to crystallize in those crises. The exilic period, for all its pain, was an inward formalization of thought. Law codes were sharpened, prophetic critiques were conserved, and scriptural narratives were adding to shapes that could be carried on the road. So the soil of later returns was sown in these centuries of urban folding under imperial pressure. The palaces and temples of the Bronze Age had given way to a more variegated patchwork of highland and coastal polities in the Iron Age, each with its own strategies of survival. Those policies in turn met the disciplined bureaucratic apparatus of empires whose logistical methods, roads, garrisons, deportations, provincial taxation reshaped the map and the human geography. Memory adapted. Temple cult could be imagined as a text. The people who later would turn and those who later would build in the name of God, law carried in their mouths and on their tablets the slow rule of experience. That cities could rise and fall, that trade sustained both kings and peasants, that empires solved political problems with population transfers, and that when the house of God is raised, the God's house was not always destroyed with it, for gods and ideas travel in people's stories. If one listens to the archaeological quiet between the layers of ash and rubble, one hears both continuity and abruptness. The click of a potter's wheel made new by a foreign hand, the faint scratch of a scribe's stylus learning alphabet that will outlive empires. These centuries, the Bronze Age, city-state world, the Iron Age birth of Israel and Palestine, the crushing and reorganizing of Assyrian and Babylonian rule, are a slow-motion drama of logistics and imagination, of grain barns and scribal rooms. They are the foundations on which later actors would base claims and counterclaims to land and to memory. They teach gently and insistently that history is equal parts material capacity and moral tale, the capacity to feed people and field armies and the stories people tell when those capacities fail or succeed. When Cyrus the Great strode into Babylon in 539 B.C., he did something that was both statecraft and public relations. He proclaimed a policy of restoration. The clay cylinder that bears his declaration is not a novel of magnanimity, but a careful administrative script. Gods returned to their temples, exiles permitted to go home, local elites encouraged to rebuild what empire could not directly govern without co-minus option. For the small battered province called Yehud, the moment was cataclysmic in its quiet way. Men who had once counted the years from a dynasty's throne now had to reckon with an imperial calendar and an Aramaic bureaucracy. They received permission, formal or rhetorical as the evidence allows, to return, to rebuild, to reconstitute a city and a cult around a temple platform that had been raised 30 years earlier. The journey back from Babylon was a migration planned with the logistics of a measured caravan, more than the mountain or prophet Shishbazzar, whose name the biblical text preserves, or Zerubbabel, his likely succession son, of the Davidic line led group store by family carrying household gods building timber and also the memory of what the temple had been. Joshua, the high priest, presided over rituals. Priests and Levites sharpened their skills again. They set an altar, re-established sacrificial rhythms, and laid the foundations of a new sanctuary. The biblical books Haggai and Zechariah themselves, not merely pious interludes, read like field manuals of morale, urging workers, measuring faith in cubits and timbers, making the theology of reconstruction practical and actionable. The site had to be cleared, stones raised, material sorts, timber imported from Lebanon by sea, labor organized across seasons. It was a project of measured engineering and ritual renewal. Imperial policy under the NEDS allowed this kind of local initiative because the Persians preferred governance by intermediaries. The Set, or opal system, the royal road, and the use of Aramaic as a lingua franca knitted the empire into administrative unity, while allowing a surprising amount of provincial autonomy. Yehud was not a satrapy in the grand sense, but a subunit inside the larger satrapy often called Eben Ari, beyond the river, administered through governors and scribes whose paperwork traveled to the capitals of empire. Aramaic replaced Akkadian and local scripts in many contexts. The new language of administration altered how power worked. Edicts, tax lists, letters, and legal decisions circulated in Aramaic. The bureaucrats chisel and the scribes read worn-out tools that made governors and priests equally legible to imperial eyes, i.e., we have epigraphic traces of this world. The Cyrus cylinder offers the imperial rhetoric. The Peplos fortification tablets and the Meashu archive from Enpur and Babylon show how land, loans, and labor were managed by networks of private entrepreneurs and royal administrators. In Egypt, the elephant and papi from a Jewish military community on the Nile tell a complementary tale. Jews living as a diaspora maintained their own temple on Elephantine Island in the late 5th century B.C., petitioned Persian officials and negotiated with non-Jewish neighbors. Their letters scratched in Aramaic insist that Jewish life did not conform to a single pattern of central temple worship. The Samaria Papyri, a cluster of Aramaic documents from an estate in the 4th century B.C.E., reveal landlords, tenants, and official routines in a landscape where identities overlapped and imperial paperwork mattered. Back in Jerusalem, seal impressions and stamped jar handles, the small accretions of everyday administration register Yehud's presence in an imperial network that reached from the Mediterranean into the Iranian plateau. The second temple that rose again in the 522nd and was completed in the reign of Darius the 5th as around 516 B.C. It became the pivot of a transformed society. No longer did kingship alone define the polity. Priestly authority, scribal learning, and the administration of land cults formed a new elite. The temple was an economic engine. Offerings, tithes, land holdings, and the stewardship of sacred rites generated resources and fed household. The priests who managed the sanctuary thus accumulated not only spiritual prestige, but practical control over taxes, over allocations of food and labor, over the calendar that governed agricultural life. Part of the reason Persia's arrangements worked was that local elites, new or renewed, were willing to administer on behalf of imperial order. The empire needed order, and the priests, scribes, and elders of Yehud needed legal sanction and protection. That protection came with strings, the narrative in Ezra and Nehemiah, a text we should treat as both theological literature and administrative dossier, preserves the names of Persian functionaries. Ptolemy, the governor of the province across the river, who writes to King Darius querying whether the Jerusalem rebuilding is legal. Archduke Xerxes in later times, who authorizes a scribe named Desra to supervise the settlement of law and society. The archaeological and documentary record does not line up in a single neat stack of proof, but the consistency of administrative vocabulary, the presence of Aramaic seals and papyri, and the large imperial archives across the Near East make the outline clear. Yehud was a provincial unit, partly autonomous, tightly bound into imperial communications, and managed by local elites who had learned to read the empire's forms. The religious reforms that accompanied this new order reshaped communal life. Temple ritual became center stage. The priestly class exerted influence on matters of property, marriage, and public life. Scribes edited in standardized text that would become the laws and stories of a people. Ezra, the scribe who arrives in Jerusalem with the backing of an imperial permit in the mid-5th century B.C.I., reads law aloud in the city square, and his reshape of community through legal performance, marital policies included, binds people into a single book and a single communal identity. Nehemiah, returning later as cupbearer to our tax heiress, arranges walls and gates, organizes labor gangs, and presides over a new urban topography where security and sanctity are inseparable. The wall is as much an administrative instrument as a defensive one. It controls movement, customs, and market rates. The archaeology of the city shows phases of rebuilding that correspond to these administrative acts. Fortifications, systems, terraces for vine and olive, and the small bureaucratic offices where seals and dough extract. The majority of Jews remained in Babylonian cities. In Egypt, in Persian garrisons and trading outposts, the diaspora flourished because the empire's connectivity made migration and settlement safe for those who could manage it. The Jewish communities in the diaspora are kept distinct rituals, sometimes competing cultic centers, and a daily negotiation between being within imperial structures and remaining ethnically particular. This multiplicity complicated the idea of a single uniform Judah. Local elites in Jerusalem wanted prestige and control. Diaspora communities wanted survival and commerce. The Persians, with their emphasis on toleration and local administration, made such plural arrangements profitable and stable for a long while. That stability was interrupted not by sudden collapse, but by a gradual overlay of new imperial logics when an energetic Macedonian storm arrived from the west. Alexander of Macedon moved through the Levant in the Tito Bay. CE with the speed and strategic cunning of a general who understood logistics, secured ports, neutralized coastal fortresses, ensured supplies. Tyre was reduced, Gaza taken, the coastal towns brought under the new Hellenistic order. Alexander's conquest did not everywhere demolish Persian institutions at once. Rather, it grafted Hellenistic structures onto older administrative patterns. Greek became a language of elites and commerce. Coinage framework shifted in poly-style institutions, councils, magistrates. The civic rhetoric of the gymnasium introduced new habits of public life. For the countryside of Judah, the change was uneven. In the cities, Greek culture gathered speed quickly. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, the empire fractured into dynasties headed by his generals, and Palestine became a prize contested between two Hellenistic powers. The two Mides of Alexandria and the Seleucid centered in Antioch. For 2 generations, the two Mides held sway, integrating the region into the economy of the Eastern Mediterranean, orienting trade toward Egypt, supporting Greek settlements on the coast, and employing Greek as the administrative idiom. Then, Antiochus III, the Seleucid monarch, fought his way through the southern Levant in the last years of the 3rd century BCE, and after the Battle of Pon-im around 200 BCE, brought the region under Seleucid administration. The map of allegiance changed. So did the social geography. Coastal towns filled with Greeks and Phoenicians became hubs of Hellenistic life. Inland rural settlers and priests retained older rituals and idioms. Yet the reach of Hellenistic culture was not purely cultural fashion. It was a form of integration that came with tax registers, garrison troops, the spread of Greek-style coinage, and the willingness of some local elites to adopt Greek manners for access to office and wealth. Those elites sometimes played the Greek card as a means of securing priestly office. The Hellenistic period in Jerusalem is a record of political transactions disguised as religious appointments. Men like Jason and Menaeus, whose careers are recorded in the books of the MCE, ABS and Josephus purchased or bribed for the high priesthood and then introduced institutions like the gymnasium into Jerusalem itself. The gymnasium was less about athletics than about cultural inscription. To adopt its practices was to step into a Hellenistic civic identity. For many in Judah, this was an affront. Religion and law were not luxuries to be traded. They structured daily life and filial memory. Under Antiochus of Epiphany, the tension escalated into coercion. Antiochus, who ruled 175 to 160 for BCE, waged campaigns to homogenize his realm, to commemorate his power by creating a less plural religious landscape and, perhaps equally, to extract more revenue from a restive province. His officials confiscated property, imposed taxes, and applied measures that touched sacred practices. A prohibition recorded in later texts against parts of Jewish ritual life, the placing of profane images in the sanctuary. The shock produced a violent reaction that began with a small family from Mordin, Mehmed and his sons, and quickly became a countrywide insurgency. The revolt that followed was not an abstract rebellion. It was a logistical achievement. The MCABS, as the brothers who lead the resistance came to be called, used the hills' concealment tests, seasonal rhythms, and guerrilla tactics to harass supply lines and to retake fortified positions. They captured Jerusalem in a series of tactical moves, cleansed the temple, and rededicated it in Hongbe, CE. The candles of that rededication are remembered as Hanukkah, a ritual commemoration of an action that was simultaneously religious purification and the assertion of political autonomy. Out of war grew a dynasty. The Hasmonean family born of revolt extended its power through both piety and force. Simon, Jonathan, John AI and Usand Alexander saw the state expand. Samaria conquered Galilee, brought under control Idumea subject to rule and, in one measure conversion, the Hasmoneans claimed both priestly and political sovereignty. They minted coins with Hebrew legends and royal iconography. They issued decrees and they built fortresses as instruments of control. Their rule reshaped the region's map and its social fabric. Forced conversions of neighboring populations like the Idmanzan, the Tur and Nes created a frontier of religious identity that was mutable and contested. The Hasmoneans employed mercenaries, fielded armies, and negotiated marriages and alliances in a Mediterranean world where dynastic power often required diplomatic maneuver as much as military success. The internal tensions that accompanied Hasmone and rule were as consequential as the external ones. Hellenistic urban culture continued to exert pressure, and within Judah, the old priestly families and the emergent class of scribes, teachers and legal interpreters negotiated authority. The sectarian cleavages that we later name Pharisees, Sadducees, essence have their roots in the social configurations of this period. The Sadducees largely represented temple aristocracy and high priestly families comfortable with power, property, and collaboration when it served security and status. The Pharisees accumulated a popular following through their rulings on purity, Sabbath, and everyday practice. They sat among the people and argued law on the streets and in synagogue. The essence, or at least communities that correspond to what the Dead Sea Scrolls show us, retreated into aesthetic communes, building alternative calendars, writing apocalyptic texts, and imagining purity as withdrawal rather than political mastery. These factional lines were not merely theological, they were quietly and decisively about who controlled land, who controlled the temple economy, and who controlled interpretation of law that mediated daily life. The Hasmonean kings, by concentrating priestly and royal functions, inflamed rivalries and opened opportunities for outside intervention. When Salam Alexander's death gave way to a dynastic quarrel between Aristobulus D and Hanes S, Roman appetites were already alert to a region where political clients could be installed in text. In 63 B.C., Pompey I the Great walked into Jerusalem as a power broker, a Roman who knew how to convert local splits into long-term strategic advantage. He entered the Holy of Holies, a moment that, even if politically rational to a Roman general who wanted to establish authority, read like sacrilege to many in Jerusalem. He left a rearranged polity here too as high priest and death knot. But under the shadow of Rome, from Pompey's intervention, emerged a phase in which Rome preferred to rule by clients. Antipater of Idumea, a man adept at live Ventini politics, placed his son Herod at the side of Rome. Herod the Great, appointed king by the Roman Senate in 40 B.C., and reigning in earnest by 37 B.C., after a campaign of consolidation, epitomized the Herodian synthesis that gave this era its shape. Herod was a master of monumental building, of patronage, and of ruthless political calculation. He rebuilt the temple in grandeur, not merely as a pious act, but as an instrument of legitimacy. The enlarged platform, the dressed stones, the colonnaded courts, the waterworks, these were engineered claims to permanence. The stones, he said, many quarried at a distance and hauled by teams of laborers and overseen by architectural masters, required supply chains, almost imperial in scale, timber from Lebanon, line-dressed masonry, specialized craftsmen brought from afar. His Caesarea Maritime was a different kind of claim, a maritime capital with a deep water harbor, a breakwater, amphitheaters, and a city grid that announced Roman urban norms on the Mediterranean shore. It was to be a gateway for goods, for garrisons, and for the cultural traffic Rome wanted to encourage. Herod's program was logistics and patronage. Water systems cut into the rock, aqueducts feeding his palaces, fortified hilltop compounds like Herodium and Mest-A that served as retreats and strongholds, and a network of roads that tied his realm to the Roman arteries. He balanced Jewish sensibilities with Hellenistic Phoenician Roman loyalty. He named cities after Roman patrons. He built temples tuned on Jewish deities in certain localities, and he yet preserved and amplified Jerusalem's central sanctuary. His judicious and brutal management of elites kept a fractured society in place for decades. When he died in 4 CE, he left a kingdom splintered among heirs and a long list of public works that would endure as Roman era scaffolding Rome's incorporation of Judea into the imperial provincial order moved along to parallel tracks the client-king arrangement, and when Rome wished tighter controlled erect provincial administration in 6C, after the deposition of Herod's son Archelaus, the province of Judea was organized under the rule of a Roman prefect or procurator and quaere, in Ias's sense, as formalized a fiscal regime that would periodically provoke and arrest. Taxes were a material presence in daily life. They were collected, counted, and forwarded to imperial treasuries. They required local functioning offices, summaries of land and population, and the cooperation or coercion of local notables. The Roman legions in neighboring Syria were always a reminder that sovereignty was backed by a mobility of force that moved on roads. The machinery of Roman law with its courts and appeals met Jewish courts with their own HLIC. Sometimes the two systems negotiated. Sometimes they collided. The social fabric in Roman Palestine was textured by these collisions. The temple still monopolized religious centrality and much of economic power. Sadducee on priestly families managed sacrifices and offerings that fed households and distributed goods. PHRIZ groups ran in the shadow and in the light of synagogues where scriptural interpretation and communal disciplinary power knitted local communities. The Essenes kept their distance, writing deterministic and apocalyptic manuscripts at Qumran that would later astonish the modern world. A new current. Zealots would later agitate with armed struggle. But in the Herodian and early Roman periods, one finds more an array of strategies: legal argument, economic maneuvering, localized revolt, and the quiet faith of rural peasants who calibrated their lives to planting and harvest, to priestly festivals, and the market demands of coastal trade. Economically, Judea sat at the junction of Mediterranean trade and inland agrarian production. Olive oil, wine, wheat, and pastoral goods moved through ports and marketplaces. Pottery, KILS, workshops, and coin mints facilitated commerce. The Hasmonean coinage had been an assertion of sovereignty. Herodian and later Roman coinage reflected political realities and monetary integration with imperial circuits. Roads mattered not because Romans loved paving alone, though they did, but because movement of goods, troops, and official correspondence required them. The Viam Arison, the inland highways channeled soldiers and merchants alike. Caravan stops disciplined the flow of grain and of information. Religion remained a public business as much as a private devotion. Pilgrimage rhythms, festivals like Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot brought crowds into Jerusalem at certain seasons. Those crowds were logistical challenges for provisioning, policing, and official oversight. The temple officers managed the influx, collecting offerings, selling animals, overseeing ritual purity. Operations as mundane and as sophisticated as any municipal administration. Synagogues increasingly provided local relief and instruction. Scribes and teachers circulated codifying practice and law, the production of sacred texts, the reading aloud of Torah, the social control enforced by communal norms. These were the soft power of a society remade after catastrophe. If there was an irony in these centuries, it is that empires produced order through instruments that simultaneously created the conditions for deep local assertion. Cyrus restored temples and repopulated provinces to secure his rule. Alexander carried Greek civic forms into a world already organized by satraps and scribes, and those forms altered how communities represented themselves. The Hasmonean-esque claimed independence through a revolt that began as a defense of ritual purity, but they became monarchs who faced the same problems of dynastic succession, fiscal extraction, and imperial diplomacy as any other kings. Rome, for its part, could extract taxes and build roads precisely because it negotiated constantly with local elites and used local institutions where useful. The result across these centuries is not a simple trajectory toward imperial homogenization, but a palimpsest of overlapping authorities. Persian governors and Aramaic scribes, Hellenistic magistrates and Greek gymnasia, Hasmonean priests who issued coins in Hebrew and Herodian builders who carved Roman motifs into Judean hills. In the long nights when stones cool and the city's breath comes slow, the soundscape across these eras is instructive. Clinking weights in a market, the scrape of a mason's chisel, a scribe's reed scratching, an administrative line, the distant belliet of flocks on a terrace slope, the small steady flames on an altar. Empires moved armies and set taxes, but ordinary life was made of those rhythms. The Second Temple period, from its Persian-sponsored rebuilding through Hellenistic pressures and Hasmonean assertion through Odeon's emphasis under Rome, is the history of how society reorganized its economy around cult and law, how elites learned to read empire's forms, and how everyday logistics, roads, seaports, aqueducts, written permits, stamped seals and coinage structured power as decisively as speeches or proclamations. If one listens closely, the scribe's ink and the mason's hammers tell the same story. Communities learned to use imperial institutions to preserve a measure of self minus rule. The Persians offered administrative templates and permitted local cults. The Hellenistic world offered a lingua franca, institutions of civic life, and provocative modes of display that would become a focal point of identity and resistance. Rome introduced an intensity of taxation, legal structures, and building that remade the landscape into a stitched-together tapestry of imperial and local nodes. Each overlay left material traces, letters that crisscrossed the empire, coins buried in hoards under the floor of the farmhead, a stone dressing at the edge of a temple platform, the imprint of a seal on a jar sent to the market. Those traces are our evidence. The punctuation marks on a long sentence that describes how a people in a land negotiated survival and meaning beneath the shadows of empires. The quiet that follows is not final. The textures of Persian bureaucracy and Aramaic administration, the Hellenistic lexicon, and the Hasmonean claim to priestly royal authority, and the Roman roads and Herodian monuments together set the scene for what would come next: greater resistance, harsher oppression, and a long series of contests over who had the right to stand in the temple courts and interpret the law. In the meantime, the stonework stands. Letters survive on papers and pots. Hand-written histories keep the sound of negotiations alive. The Second Temple, rebuilt and reworked, remained the locus through which politics, religion and economy braided themselves into communal life, and through which the very idea of a people was refashioned, tested and defended against changing regimes. So when Rome finally imposed its full administrative weight, appointing prefects to enforce taxes and keep order, the ground beneath Judea had already been turned and measured many times. Quirinius' census in 6 CE, the appointment of procurators who prized efficiency, and the episodes of heavy minus-handed governance that came later were illegible, because a long history of provincial administration had made the population legible. The social fault lines were more visible now than at any earlier point. The Sadducees, tied to the temple and its economic apparatus, had real leverage in the city. The Pharisees, with networks of teachers and an interpretive authority rooted in the text, commanded respect in village and town. The Essenes withdrew, preserving texts that later lay hidden in cave. The Zealots would soon insist on a different calculus. that Roman presence was intolerable and that resistance, even at great cost, was the only legitimate path. But in Herod's age and the immediate decades after, another kind of synthesis was in place. Imperial logistics and local patronage produced a fragile pragmatic order. Herod's synthesis, architectural, administrative, political, sought permanence in stone and inscription. The Herodian expansion of the Temple Mount with its enormous dressed stones was a claimed continuity. The port city of Caesarea was an opening to Mediterranean commerce and to Roman politics. The city and the countryside were interdependent. Agrarian surpluses fed urban consumption. Ports connected to imperial markets. Temples provided social insurance in the form of charity and ritual redistribution. Yet every magisterial inscription, every reconstructed stairway, and every minted coin also broadcast a political message. Sovereignty here looks like prosperity, and prosperity is best secured by a ruler who can build and who can meet Rome's demands. This was not then a simple sweeping of one culture aside by another. Persian toleration, Hellenistic synthesis, hegemony and assertion and Roman patronage, all layered upon local forms of life. The Jewish communities adapted their calendar, their law and their economy in response. They built walls and courtyards. They codified customs and rituals, and assured the next generation to read the texts that had sustained their identity. By the time the Herodian stones cooled, the people of the land had become a political organism, competent in the languages of empire and insistent in the vocabulary of tradition. It is a lesson in governance as much as empire ety. Empires shape institutions, and institutions reshape societies. Listen, if you will, for the small sounds beneath the grand narratives, the steady rhythm of taxes counted in an account book, the muffled conversation of elders deciding a dispute in the shadow of a city gate, the snick of a seal on a board, the wind over a newly laid terrace where olives wait for harvest. Those are the instruments of history. They tell us why Persian policy mattered, why the rebuilding of the temple reorganized social life, why Hellenistic culture could be intoxicating and dangerous, and why Rome's roads would eventually become pathways that either smoothed or severed ties. The centuries roll by softly, but they leave marks, stones aligned, texts compiled, laws enforced, and memories preserved. The past is not merely a catalogue of events. It is economies organized, languages adopted, alliances made, and the patient work of building brick by brick, law by law toward an idea of community that could survive under emperors and kings alike. The revolt that broke out in 6 CE was not a sudden thunderbolt, so much as a long simmering storm that finally found an outlet. Centuries of layered rule, Persian, Hellenistic, Hasmonean, Herodian, Roman, had left Palestine a mosaic of loyalties, privileges, and grievances. In the spring of 6, a riot in the port city of Caesarea, where Greco-Roman civic pride and Jewish communal honor clashed, set a match to tinder already dry from heavy taxation, corrupt procurators, and the simmering resentments of client elites. Local councils in Jerusalem fractured along priestly, Lyceum, Pharisaic, and popular lines. Bands of zealots and messianic aspirants organized to seize the moment. The Roman response at first misread politics for punishment. Assyrian Legatus Gallus marched into Judea with haste and arrogance, trailing the banner of a republic that no longer existed. He was thrown back at Beth Horon in late 6. His retreat turned route. The image of Roman invincibility bruised for an empire that liked to imagine itself eternal. That embarrassment bought the rebels time and courage. And Rome, which does not forgive public humiliation lightly, prepared for a reply in scale. Hero puts oppression in the hands of Vespasian, a seasoned general who moved to treat the problem as an operation in theatre and logistics, rather than as a moral drama. Vespasian did what Roman commanders did when facing fortified countries. He mobilized legions from Syria and the Danubian provinces. amassed siege engines and engineers, organized supply convoys along the coastal road and inland arteries, and pursued a methodical campaign in Galilee and the Judean hinterland to isolate Jerusalem. Where the rebels had the passion of belief, the Romans brought the patient instruments of empire, circumventilation, ramparts of timber-and earth, mobile towers and bliss-e, a logistic style whose success depended on grain shipped from Egypt and the steady punctuality of the imperial grain dole, Jose Cif Pinchos, the most famous chronicler of those years and a survivor turned client historian of the Flavian emperors. Records, names, numbers, and sieges with a mixture of eyewitness detail and rhetorical purpose. His testimony is one of our main windows into how the war unfolded, but is a window with tinted glass, still, from his pages and the scattered archaeological traces. There emerges the shape of a campaign that ground the province into a new form. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the event that seared itself into Jewish memory and into the annals of empire, was the culmination of this methodical climb. Titus, Vespasian's son, arrived with the field army in a cluster of legions, units like Extratensos and Vermicedon ICI among them, which established permanent camps in the valleys round the city. The Romans probed, harried, starved, and then assaulted. They invested Jerusalem in concentric lines, cut off wells, closed the roads, and let famine do what Roman engineering alone could not. The defenders were not a single unified force, but a fractious coalition of zealots, temple soldiers, and local militias. Their courage was fierce, their logistics tragically fragile. Josephus gives us a tableau of panicked council, internal slaughter, rival factions burning stores to deny them to the enemy, and sometimes, in the most tragic of ironies, burning the very bridges of survival their own city needed. The Romans built traps and tore at the walls with rams and fire. They hauled up siege towers and exploited breaches with coordinated infantry. When the inner court of the temple, the second temple that Hadrian and Herod had both enlarged and ornamented in different centuries, finally fell, the Romans looted. Flames licked at gilt and cedar. The temple, a sacrificial center of a people's religious life, was destroyed in 70 CE. A single physical act that had reverberations out across time and space. The immediate practicalities were straightforward in a terrible way. A conquered city meant spoils, prisoners to be sold, tax rolls to be rewritten, and garrisons to be installed so that imperial control could be exercised. An arch in Rome would later celebrate the procession of the temple's man-arrayed trumpets, but the cultural reverberations were immense. The temple was not only a building, it was the heart of liturgy, land economy for Judean society. With its destruction, sacrificial cult could no longer organize politics and identity in the same way. The result was not a simple collapse but a redirection. Religious authority, which had once been concentrated in high priestly lineage and in the Sanhedrin's proximity to the temple, had to be reimagined. In this reimaging, Yanon Benz, a cow smuggled out of the burning city, so the story goes, carried in a bier among the dead, became a symbol and an agent of adaptation. He negotiated with Vespasian to establish a center of learning at Yavn, IA, where the rabbinic elite secured the survival of law, liturgy and communal institutions in forms not dependent on a central shrine. Synagogues, study houses, and the development of a portable liturgy, prayers and legal codes, instead of sacrifices, became the new scaffolding of Jewish life. What had been a temple-centric religion grew, in the next centuries, into Rabbit-IC Judaism. The network of mice, legal race-sponsoring communities, spread across the Roman Empire, the and worlds. At the same time, the explosion of Jewish diasporic life accelerated. Even before 70 Jewish communities were firmly established across the Mediterranean, and especially in a Babylon where the mice at Sur and Pumbedita would in time become preeminent. After the war, countryside depopulation, enslavement S, and the selling of captives in Mediterranean slave markets multiplied dispersal. The Fiscus Judaicus, a tax instituted by Vespasian to replace the temple tax and directed into the imperial coffers, is a small but symbolically potent administrative act. Rome turned religious tribute into fiscal income and, in doing so, underscored the new order. Land tenure changed to large tracts CTS of agricultural land were confiscated and offered to veterans, transforming patterns of ownership, tenancy, and peasant security. Fields that had fed temple gardens and priestly estates were parceled, resold, turned into villa estates or abandoned. A rural social map shifted under the weight of imperial policy and the demographic shock of war. The story did not end in 70. In 132 CE, a new conflagration, the Bar revolt, rose in response to another set of misread policies and old wounds. Hadrian's plans for Jerusalem, his decision to rebuild the city as a Roman colony in the imperial mold and to rename it Olia capital in A, and according to some sources, his prohibition of circumcision and the plan to build a temple to Jupiter on the ruined temple platform were perceived rightly or wrongly as an existential threat. In that atmosphere, a charismatic leader, Simeon Bar Kokhba, rallied thousands. Rabbi Oke, one of the towering figures of Rabbinic Judaism, famously hailed him as the potential Messiah. For 2 years, Kokhba established the pseudo-state, minting coins, organizing fortresses in the Judean highlands, and mobilizing a guerrilla strategy based on the terrain's cave, ridges, and narrow passes. The rebels' initial successes owed much to mobility and the intimate knowledge of local logistics to cash stockpiled into the difficulty Rome had in deploying heavy equipment in Wadi Essent hills. Rome's answer when it came was thorough. Hadrian sent as Julius Caesar from Britain with a reconstituted force of legions and auxiliary troops. The general's campaign was a war of attrition, of scorched earth sweeps, fortified place by place reduction and mass deportations. Where the rebels had hit and run capacity, the empire fielded relentless weight backed by resources, siege engines, cavalry blocks, fleets to patrol the coast, and garrison rotations to prevent exhaustion. The war ended in catastrophe for Bar Kokhba's movement. Jewish losses were enormous. Villages depopulated. Many of the male population of military age were killed, enslaved or fled. Hadrian's policy in the aftermath was imperial decoration for suppression. The renaming of the province to Syria-Palestinian and the re-founding of Jerusalem as Olia capital in A were gestures of both administrative convenience and deliberate cultural erasure intended to dilute the link between the land and the Jewish polity. Jews were, and from the city, the hopes of a territorial center effectively cut back. Memory hardened. Commemoration became a new kind of battlefield. Liturgy and lamentation took the place of statehood, and the exile was ritualized. Next year in Jerusalem became not only a phrase of Passover yearning, but a political, social, and religious posture maintained across Israel. Out of disaster came forms of resilience. The Rabbi is consolidated. Oral traditions were codified into Tichu, and the Mishnah itself compiled by Judah hands around 200 C. East, and in part as a product of this reorientation Lori invented for life without a temple. The diaspora Jewish world largely concentrated in Mesopotamia, and the wider Mediterranean gained institutional strength. The Palestinian Jewish community shifted its center of gravity to the Galilee, even as gravestones, coins, and the archaeological recorded hundreds of abandoned villages in the south. The land remembered by what? Ritual and law. The loss of polity generated a literature of hope and a practice of memory that would form millennia orient Jewish identity. The centuries that followed the Roman wars are no less dramatic, but their violence was compressed into different rhythms under the Eastern Empire. The Byzantium that Constantine's Christianizing of the imperial project had reshaped with Constantine and his mother Henella's pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 326 and, with the emperor's patronage, Palestine gradually became a central stage for an imperial piety that sought to materialize sacred memory in stone and mosaic. Helena's excavation of holy sites and Constantine's decision to build monumental churches. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, consecrated in Thebes, is the most famous example, created almost as an afterthought, an industry of pilgrim infrastructure. Pilgrimage was a late antique mass movement of bodies and money. Not only did pilgrims travel to pray, they consumed olive oil lamps, bought holy oil, left donations, required food and lodgings, and supported craftsmen who produced reliquaries and icons. Rows that had been used for legions now carried procession. Coastal ports such as Caesarea, Damascus, and Gaza handled pilgrim traffic. Caravan routes from the interior converged on sanctified places. The income from these movements helped underwrite new episcopal and monastic establishments. Christianization was not merely top-own architecture. It was lived in monasteries that asserted themselves across the Judean desert and anchoritic caves where men and women pursued aesthetic perfection and, in sea houses that became centers of learning and charity. Figures such as St. Sobbers, who founded the monastery of Mars Saba in the 5th century, and Jerome later in Bethlehem, who produced the Latin Vulgate, show how Palestine became both a place of anchorite withdrawal and active theological production. Eusebius of Caesar, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century, located the Christian past in the geography of the present. Pilgrims like the anonymous Bordeaux pilgrim of 33 and the Roman on Ager, a few decades later left trove logs that are among our most immediate windows into how rites were performed at holy site, how crowds processed through Basil, as in how the sensory impression of sacred space, incense, chanting, the flicker of lamps affected devotion. All this did not erase Jewish or Samaritan life. Jews continued to live in Galilee, in pockets of the coastal plain and in cities, under the watchful eye of bishops and Byzantine arms that often, though not uniformly, pushed them to the margins of civic life. The Samaritans concentrated around Mount Gerizim and Nabal as kept their own rights and identity. Yet periodic revolts and the steady expansion of Christian institutions diminished their public footprint. Legal restrictions, social prejudice, and sporadic violence made coexistence complex. But economic interdependence, artisans working in the same workshop, merchants trading across confessional lines, peasants cultivating land for bishops, landlords and monasteries kept daily life entangled. Monasteries became landlords, bishops became civic magistrates, and charity networks began to replace municipal welfare in many towns. The conversion of Basil, as in the conspicuous display of imperial investment in Jerusalem elites leveraged to shape urban form and demographic composition. The 5th century Council of Chalced elevated Jerusalem's bishop to an episcopal rank of greater prestige, a formal recognition of the city's new sacral centrality within the Christian imperial order. The Byzantine mosaic of Palestine was visible in stone and soil, Basil as with mosaic floors depicting ships and vines. The Madaba map in Jordan recording the Christian landscape like a holy seat grotti. Hospices for pilgrims, hospitia that offered food, lodgings and baths. Urban markets supplying pilgrims with bread and lamps and spices. Economic life revolved around olive oil presses and wine production in the countryside, with estates often worked by tenant cultivators bound by obligation and by contract. The rural calendar, or pruning in winter. Harvesting in autumn continued across centuries as the durable baseline beneath political change. The countryside with its terraces and systems preserved continuity even as its urban centers altered in color and faith. The Byzantine period was not unbroken serenity. The Persian Sea is an Aegean invasion in 614 led by Shah Bey Resend allied with local Jewish groups unhappy with Byzantine rule, captured Jerusalem for a time and carried off many relics. Horace Ellis's recovery in the 622nd was violent and costly. The imperial center had been weakened by doctrinal disputes, official drains, and a languishing provincial bureaucracy. When the Arab-Muslim forces struck in the 632nd, they encountered an empire that was less impregnable than it had once seemed. The victories at Ajay in Aden in 634, the decisive Battle of Yarmouk in 636 shattered Byzantine military presence in Syria and opened the way for the conquest of Palestine. The islands of continuity, bishops, towns, monasteries, and merchants remained, but their political horizon shifted. From the Arab vantage, the conquest can be read as swift and administrative, a reordering more than an overturn. In military terms, the campaigns of the 60 were remarkably mobile. The Syrian hesitant, the coast worked reversed by troops who combined cavalry speed with knowledge of local tribal networks. Commanders such as Hal ad-Din al-Wa'id early in the Syrian campaigns and later governors who consolidated control used the established urban centers and roads for provisioning. Jerusalem surrendered in 637 after negotiation with Aspateronius, the city's patriarch, and tradition has it that Kafuma visited the city in 638 and accepted terms guaranteeing Christian rights. Whether all the details of later pacts are authentic is a matter for historians, but the practical result was the inclusion of Palestine within a new polity that was to be Muslim-led yet still home to significant Christian and Jewish populations. The Umayyad Caliphs, who established Damascus as their capital from 6 invested in the region's symbolic and civic architecture. Abd-el-Melik's decision to build the Dome of the Rock completed 691 on the platform of the Temple Mount was audacious and deliberate. It was an assertion of Islamic presence and claim, both political and theological. The monument's golden dome, Byzantine-style mosaics and Arabic inscriptions, some of them Michael, articulating the unity of God and critiquing Christian doctrines, announced a new center of memory anchored in the city's most charged spot. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was expanded under Al-Walid and others. These works used local craftsmen, many of them of Byzantine Christian origin, and employed mosaic techniques, columns and marbles that echoed earlier imperial styles while being inscribed with a new Arabic voice. The physical transformation was in effect a cultural translation, continuity of place in different motifs and a new textual frame. Administrative change accompanied architectural assertion. The Caliphate organized the conquered lands into military districts called Azin-ed, Junder Philistine, the military district roughly corresponding to central and southern Palestine, established a framework for garrisoning troops, collecting taxes and adjudicating disputes under the authority of Damascus and later regional governors. Capital shifted. Leader Ludden under her had initiative. The planned city of Ramla would emerge as an administrative and commercial hub, offering a new node for markets, postal routes and judicial business. The language of administration would move over the next centuries from Greek and Syriac to Arabic, a transition set in motion by the Umayyad reforms and accelerated under Abd-el-Melik, who also reformed coinage to carry Arabic inscriptions and Islamic formulas. Small but powerful signs of a changing political grammar, Arabization and Islamization. However, while long day, your processes uneven across districts and social layers. For most rural peasants, the daily concerns of water, land, olive oil, and seasonal labor mattered more than the rituals sure to be changed at the top. Conversion to Islam often proceeded in piecemeal fashion. Some converts were motivated by affinity or faith, others by the official incentives that came with shedding jizya payments, and yet others by social mobility within the new elite networks. Importantly, Christian communities were recognized under a system of taxes and legal autonomy. their bishops continuing to manage personal law, and Jewish communities, long dispersed, re-established themselves in various towns and in the Galilee under the Caliphate's protection. Trade networks that had linked the Mediterranean and the Levant did not collapse. They were reoriented. Mediterranean ports now formed links to the growing Islamic world, connecting Palestine to the markets of Egypt, Syria, Iraq and beyond. Pilgrimage did not end with the Arab conquest. It transformed. Muslim veneration of the mosque and the rock on the Temple Mount created new layers of sacred geography, while Christian pilgrimages continued, with varying degrees of state oversight. The Call if El sometimes patronized Christian institutions. At other times, it enforced the fiscal prerogatives that turned the maintenance of churches and monasteries into a negotiation between local communities and provincial authorities. The urban shape of places like Jerusalem, Ramla, and Gaza was refashioned by markets, caravans, and new residential quarters, some built for Arab tribal groups who had settled as soldiers or administrators. The economy adapted. Olive oil presses continued. Vineyards remained in some areas, though the Umayyad and later Abbasid policies often discouraged the public sale of wine. Craftsmen produced new idioms that braided Byzantine technique with emerging Islamic aesthetics. The Dome of the Rock's mosaic echoed the earlier Christian basilicas, even as they offered verses from the Quran. Artisans copied motifs and reinterpreted them in a new Lulu Grigi Caladium. When the Umayyad Caliphate fell and the Abbasids moved the political center to Baghdad after 750, Palestine became more of a provincial periphery in political weighting, but not in cultural memory. It remained a locus of sacred geography for Jews, Christians and Muslims alike, and its towns and countryside remained integrated into trade and pilgrimage circuits. Over time, Arabic became dominant in public life and law, yet local Syria, Achaia and Greek liturgies and languages persisted in Lugrigi Kalan domestic spaces for generations. What the early Islamic centuries did was less a sudden overwrite than a layering. New inscriptions over old stones, new prayers in the same basilicas or in converted spaces, new tax rolls written in Arabic while earlier patterns of tenancy and agriculture persisted. Through these centuries, the land continued to be both a stage for imperial designs and an archive of memory. The transformation of urban centers, the re-founding of Jerusalem as Aliyah, its late consecration within the Christian imperial imagination, his reclamation and redefinition as an Islamic sanctuary shows how imperial politics, religious imagination, and local social structures intersected. Among the human consequences were shifts in land tenure, as imperial veterans became landholders, as monasteries acquired estates, and as communities adapted to a changing official regime. Among cultural consequences were the rewriting of lit, UAGCGY, the codification of law in Rabbit, Isaiah and Christian text, the rise of monastic literature, and the inscription of new holy geographies that would be read and reread for centuries. The memory of the temples and their loss would be kept alive in Jewish ritual and lament. The presence of new domes and minaretes would be inscribed into Muslim piety, and Christians would continue to move their feet to Jerusalem's gates. If there is a single quiet lesson that stretches from the fires of 70 CE through imperial basilicas gilded under Constantinople to the golden dome set on the rock by Abd-al-Malik, it is that the landscape of Palestine was never static. It was a pinpest of power and prayer, where armies and pilgrims wrote in overlapping hands, empires marched in measured formations, and left behind roads and laws, prophets and rabbis, bishops and aesthetics, inscribed meanings and practices. Peasants kept the terraces and presses that fed them all. The scale of conflict mattered. Legions, sieges, official reorganizations shaped destinies, but so did the small administrative decisions. A tax remitted here, a bishop ran odes there, an academy established at YAV that stood like a lamp for a dispersed people. The The violence of empires could destroy stones, but the daily quieter infrastructures of law, liturgy, and livelihood were the true repositories of continuity, and they were the means by which communities survived, adapted and reinvented themselves in an old land that seemed again and again to demand reinvention. And so in the hush after siege and construction, in the silence of monasteries and the bustle of markets, the people of Palestine, Jewish, Christian, Samaritan, Muslim, Roman, Arab continued their lives on terraces and in courts under domes and basilicas, each generation making of the same soil a new story. Some of those stories were written in capitals on coins and arches. Most were written in prayers uttered in many languages, and legal decisions debated in the shade of synagogues and churches, in the smell of olive oil pressing in autumn, and the creak of a ship's rigging in the harbour. The land remembered all of it patiently, like an old keeper of tales who collects every sound and keeps them until one night long after someone tells them again. The Western banners that arrived across the Mediterranean in the last years of the 11th century did not come as an anonymous tide, but as a network of knots, princes, towns, monastic orders, merchants, each pulling its own rope toward the same distant prize. Jerusalem, in 1099, the culmination of that tangled enterprise was vivid and absolute. A small, fiercely organized army fed by Italian ships and funded by northern lords climbed the terraces and alleys of the city and took it. Godfrey of Boulogne refused the royal title and accepted the more modest honor of advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. His brother Baldwin, who would crown himself king in 1100, could be more pragmatic. The capture of Jerusalem did not create any new polity. It created a collection of polities with fragile logistics tied together by sea routes and by an insistently for unlegal and religious structure imposed on a landscape that had known many masters. From that point, the Latin presence in the Levant crystallized into four principal states that would determine the politics of the region for the next 2 centuries. The county of Edessa and the Principality of Antioch to the north, both carved from the older Byzantine and Arab patchwork. The county of Tripoli, along the Lebanon littoral, consolidated by Raymond of St. Iles' descendants by 11 Nina. And the most strategically vulnerable and symbolically luminous, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its center was coastal and continental at once. Control of Jaffa, Bequtai, and Ascalon mattered as much as the possession of Jerusalem itself, because the kingdom's lifeblood flowed ashore from the Italian maritime republics. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa did not simply trade. They negotiated quarters, tax-exempt enclaves, and naval support. In return, in many ports they enjoyed privilege after privilege. Warehouses, dedicated berths and the jerry deck are shields of consular law, and through those privileges they kept the kingdom alive. The Latin polity installed a courtly and martial architecture of rule. The hot core feudal tenure and the assizes of Jerusalem lay alongside the Latin patriarchate and the reforming monastic orders that quickly militarized. The Hospital of St. John became a military force as the Knights Hospitaller and the Temple of Solomon's applied the name, and later the troops of the Templars after their informal foundation in 1119. These were institutions aimed at projecting power outward while extracting rents inward. Land was parceled to knights as thief. Castles were carved from hilltops. Unpaid local communities remained the base of agricultural production. The Crusader lordship was never strong enough to replace Ottoman, or a Ubaid or earlier Byzantine state machinery. Rather, it superimposed a layer of Latin law and lit your GCGY on top of a continuing largely Arabic minor-speaking economy. Eastern Christians, Syriac, Greek, and Armenian clergy and communities continued to worship in their own rights, though often dispossessed of churches or pushed aside in favor of Latin administrations. Jews remained in the region, oft unmarginalized politically, but deeply woven into urban commerce. A Frankish presence was a ruling minority, urban and coastal in orientation, reliant on imports, and surprisingly pro-US in practice. They employed Arabic minor cesspes, PK king secretaries, purchased the services of Muslim farmers, and relied on local craft traditions for everything from walls to walk endowments. Strategically, the Kingdom of Jerusalem illustrates what medieval empire building looked like when projection of force depended on the sea. The coastal nodes Acre, after 1191, became the key. Were logistical hubs, food reinforcements, mercenaries, and coin arrived by ship. Hinterland castles like Beauvoir, Coq, Hawaii, Torquay, Montreal, Shoreback, and Montfort were workshops of siegecraft and local control positioned to guard roads, harvests and pilgrim trails. The Templars and Hospitallers invested deliberately in fortress design, developing concentric walls and ghetto uses that would prefigure later military architecture. These stone-laced defences were in effect expensive insurance policies paid for out of European arms and Levantine neat axes. Castles required not only building masons and mortar, but long supply chains of timber, lime and imported metal, all of which stitched the Levant into Mediterranean commerce more tightly than it had been before. Militarily, the Crusader project was a lesson in the limits of seaborne power. When faced with a region's interior, the inland arrested a tape of Syria and Egypt could, by controlling agricultural hinterlands and mobilizing cavalry, threatened coastal nodes when the ships did not appear. The structural weakness became clear as Muslim mobilization hardened under figures like Imad-ud-Din Zini, who in 1144 achieved a wrenching symbolic victory by retaking Edessa, the first of the Crusader states to fall. Zenghi's death left a succeeded energy in his son, Nureddin, who consolidated Aleppo and Damascus in the mid-12th century and sought to create a unified jihadist response to the Latin kingdom. Nureddin's policies were as much administrative and logistic as they were pious. The unification of Syrian resources into coordinated sieges, the fostering of networks of jurists and preachers, the patronage of madrasas to build long-term administrative capacity. The result was a shift from episodic raids to organized statecraft. The most consequential figure in that transformation was Salahaddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub Saladin, rising from a Kurdish military household in the service of Nureddin after the brief period of Fatimid collapse in Egypt. Saladin united Egypt and Syria into an Ayyubid polity that had both the territorial coherence and official capacity to challenge the Franks on a serious scale. The logistical architecture of his campaign was deliberate. Cavalry farms supplied epos, scouts, and a careful campaign season time to harvest cycles into the movements of Crusader forces. His decisive victory came at the Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, where he intercepted the Crusader army on the plains near the Sea of Galilee, cut its water access, and captured or destroyed its seasoned knights. The fall of Hattin opened the road to Jerusalem. By October 1187, Saladin had taken the city. He recentized control, reasserted Muslim guardianship over the Harem el-Sharif, and negotiated ransom and release rather than wholesale expulsion. The practical aim was governance. Craftsmen, merchants, scholars, and cultivators were needed for taxation and stability more than annihilation was. Western response was quick and spectacular in headline, but halting in execution. The Third Crusade 1189-112, called by Pope Gregory V. and led by Frederick I Barbarous of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II Augustus of France and Richard the F of England, achieved a maritime restoration of the coast more than a reconquest of the interior. Frederick's death in Anatolia in 119 dissipated momentum. Richard's tactical genius and Philip's withdrawal left a fragmented alliance. Richard's sieges and seas retook in 1191 and pressured coastal cities. The eventual truce with Saladin in 1190 allowed Christian pilgrims to enter Jerusalem but left political control in Muslim hands. Treaties Tier users. And tier users with clauses became a familiar pattern. Diplomacy mattered as much as swords, marriages, city-level agreements, ransom terms, and even acts of ecclesiastical recognition could alter who controlled what at any given moment. The 12th and 13th centuries were an age of attrition, negotiation, and recycling. The Crusader politics were never unified enough, nor populous enough, to be sustainable without continuous European aid. The Obids were not cohesive enough after Saladin's death in 1193 to establish a durable imperial center in Syria, and the arrival of external shocks. The Mongol advance from the east in the 1252 and 1262, the Khwarezmian raids of the 1242. The changing patterns of Mediterranean commerce complicated every actor's calculations. The city of Jerusalem was in this period as much a diplomatic pawn as it was a spiritual prize. Frederick I's negotiated entry into the city in 1229 returned it briefly to Latin administration on paper, but the underlying demographics, fortifications, and supply realities meant that such gains were often temporary. By the late 13th century, the Crusader presence hemmed into a few fortified coastal cities and is landed by hostile hinterland and was vulnerable to a more centralized, better served, and increasingly resolute opponent based in Egypt. That opponent was the Mamluk Sultan in 8, a polity that rose out of a paradox. An army of slave soldiers but young from the Eurasian steppes, trained in the barracks of Cairo and Aleppo and then promoted into command. When Mamluk leaders seized power in Egypt around 1250, they inherited a military machine with institutional discipline and a talent for horse and lance warfare that had proved ineffective at Ajay Lut in 1260, where the Mamluk general Qutuz and the future Sultan Babares turned back the far-reaching advance of the Mongols. The victory at Anja Lut, on the flatlands of the Easy Rail, was decisive in strategic terms. It stopped the Mongol tide, securing its ability to move across terrain, and it signaled to the Levant that a new hegemon with Cairo as its capital and a tight relationship between military elites and official administrators now had both the incentive and the capacity to reorder Syria and Palestine. Mamluk rule over Palestine was not a dramatic cultural rupture, so much as an administrative and military reorientation. To govern, Cairo depended on a distribution of revenue rights by Qast who then extracted taxes from villages and towns. The system was both flexible and brutal. It allowed the Sultan to reward service without creating a hereditary landed aristocracy, but it also left rural cultivators at the mercy of a rotating set of official claimants. The Mamluks inherited the ports and towns of the Levant and set about both repairing and redefining their economic function. They rebuilt caravanserais, funded KS by LS to encourage pilgrimage traffic and tried to secure trade routes that had become vulnerable after decades of conflict. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the Hajj, caravan routes to Mecca were matters of both piety and revenue, and Mamluk sultans keenly understood that facilitating safe, predictable movement of pilgrims built legitimacy in the Sunni Islamic world and justified endowments. Warfare under the Mamluks shifted from pitched European-style nightly clashes to a combination of mobile cavalry engagements, sieges and the engineering of defensive belts. Babares, who reigned from 1260 to 1277, is emblematic. A commander who combined operational daring with methodical siegecraft. He systematically targeted Crusader redouts, undermined their hinterland support and crucially prevented them from regaining logistical primacy at sea. Acre finally fell in 1291 to Alas HS Hraf Kalaland. With its fall, the explicit political presence of the Frankish kingdoms in the Levant ended. The Mamluks then razed many of the old Crusader fortifications or converted them into garrisons not out of sentiment, but out of a strategic logic. Fortified nodes could become focal points for renewed European intervention if left in a useful state for enemies. They preferred to control and repurpose rather than to romanticize. The late medieval centuries were not only years of military realignment, they were years of ecological and epidemiological upheaval. The Black Death arrived in the eastern Mediterranean in the mid-4th century and returned in waves thereafter. Mortality rates struck towns and villages unevenly but profoundly enough to depress rural production, encouraged wage demands among survivors and altered demographic patterns. Markets shivered. Some commodities became scarcer. Labor scarcity in some places raised wages and allows peasants for a time to renegotiate the terms of their tenancy. The mammal state tried to stabilize prices and to maintain revenue flows by adjusting official demands and by leaning on war endowments that supported hospitals, madrasas and charitable kitchens. Those WAF institutions which Mamluk patrons lavishly endowed left a built legacy that would be visible for centuries. Madrasa and Mausolei, ornate minareti ice, sables and K that reshaped the urban fabric of Jerusalem. Hebron, Gazian smaller towns, the architectural vocabulary of the period, intricate stone carving, Mak-Ornis, inlaid marble and calligraphic, came the public face of Mamluk patronage and a reminder that statecraft also meant spectacle. In their provincial rule, the Mamluks stitched Palestine more tightly into the Islamic economic world centered on Cairo and Damascus. They defended Syria from Mongol return, policed the trade routes, and in doing so stabilized the region enough to allow markets to function and cities to refurbish. At the same time, Mamluk policies, the temporary nature of IQ-tiers, the prevalence of military governors, the reliance on Cairo supplying networks left the region with administrative and official patterns that were ripe either for continuity or for wholesale change by a more centralized imperial force. That force arrived from the northwest in the early 16th century. The Ottoman conquest of 1516 to 1517 and the Sultan Selimoti was vast and dramatic from the vantage of empires. At Majdab, near Aleppo on August 24th, 1516 the forces of the Ottoman state decisively defeated the Mamluk field army. Within a year, Cairo had fallen and the Mamluk Sultanate was extinguished. Palestine was then folded into the vast Ottoman imperial machinery. For the first decade, Ottoman control meant the implantation of imperial structures Europe had rarely seen here. Provincial governors, beys, accountable to Istanbul, cadastral surveys, Tyre, recording villages and tax obligations. The timber system in which the revenues from land up supported cavalry revenues for the Sultan. Over time, these systems would mutate. The team are giving way to tax farming, iltizam, as the early modern state adjusted to metropolitan official needs and the rising cost of artillery and administration. But the initial Ottoman order remained the map of power. Jerusalem as an object of imperial interest because of its holy sites and because of the attention it attracted from European governments acquired special status. Saul and the magnificent restoration of the city walls in the 1532 and 1542 is an emblematic act. It was both a practical fortification project and an imperial statement, an assertion that Istanbul now governed under the custodians of the sacred. Rural life under the Ottomans retained features of late medieval organization, seasonal networks of pastoralists, the musher communal land-holding arrangements in many villages, and the persistence of local notables who mediated between state and society. But it also changed in subtle ways. Tax registers became the basis for property claims. Legal pluralism under the millet system allowed religious communities to govern family matters. Ottoman courts and the later Tanzim and legal reforms introduced alternatives for dispute resolution. Cities Jerusalem, Nablus, acreage Afar remained lively centers of production and exchange. Nabal as soap industry. Hibibia runs trade in glass and local crafts. Acres maritime commerce. and Jaffa's citrus groves were all staples of a regional economy that now had more direct channels to imperial markets. In the 18th century, the balance of power in the coastal north tilted with the rise of semi-minus, autonomous local potentates. Most famously Zahir al-Umar in the Galilee. Ahir's accommodation with European merchants, his fortification of Acre, and his encouragement of agricultural expansion around Nazareth and Tiberias created an entrepreneurial burst of economic growth and a model of local autonomy that showed how Ottoman rule could be both strong and permissive. Razii he consolidated a regional base. Gzi al-Pasha later transformed Acre into an urban fortress under Ottoman governors and defended it against Napoleon's expedition in 17. Napoleon's siege famously interrupted by an Anglo-Ottoman flotilla A under Admiral Sidney Smith that supplied guns and ammunition to Gzi is a telling example of the era's geopolitics. European power now projected itself into the Levant, not only as crusade but as hard strategic geopolitics, where access to ports to Koinji stations to diplomatic privileges, the capitulation mattered decisively. The 19th century amplified these dynamics. The age of reform, centralization, and European penetration altered Ottoman Palestine in ways that would prove consequential for the 20th century. The Tanzam, at reforms of 1839 to Itiscus, announced an imperial reorganization that promised equality before the law, centralization of tax collection, and the modernization of the army and the bureaucracy. The Land Code of 1858, ostensibly a bureaucratic measure designed to regularize land title and tax revenue, had effects its drafters did not fully intend. Registration required peasant families to appear before Ottoman officials. Many were suspicious of registration because of liability to higher taxes and conscription. Some villages therefore allowed notables, middlemen or urban agents to register lands in their name. The result over decades was the concentration of registered title in the hands of a smaller number of proprietors. Those proprietors were sometimes local urban notables. Sometimes they were or unbiased institutions using Ottoman law and the flexibility of local agent. A mechanism of legal modernization thus opened channels that European capital and news Zionist organizations would later exploit. European cons and missionaries proliferated across Palestine in the 19th century. France asserted pro-atik claims over Catholics and built schools and hospitals. Russia assumed a protective role over Orthodox pilgrims, establishing the Russian compound in Jerusalem. Britain and Prussia sponsored Protestant missions and an Anglican bishopric in the 1842. Every consulate brought with it legal protection for its nationals, an intimate interest in archaeological and liturgical disputes, and a willingness to invest in infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and sometimes railways. The Suez Canal's opening in 1816 multiplied European travel and trade. European tourists and pilgrims flowed into Palestinian towns in numbers unimagined a century earlier. Infrastructure projects reshaped transport and the economy. The Jaffa, a Jerusalem railway, completed in 1892, brought Jerusalem within a day's journey of the Mediterranean, altering pilgrimage rhythms, postal connections, and the market for perishable goods. The Hizas Railway, built by the Ottomans at the turn of the century to link Damascus with Medina, announced new imperial ambitions and created new nexus points. Although its lines only grazed the edges of Palestine, ports were modernized and repositioned. Haifa's expansion, under late Ottoman and Pharaoh paces, shifted the center of northern maritime trade from Acre to a deeper, more sheltered harbor. A technical decision with broad economic consequences. These material changes ran alongside social and cultural ones. Jewish immigration in the late 19th. The first Aliyah from the 1882 and the second day, Ayah in the early 1900 seconds brought thousands to the land. often settling on purchased estates and founding agricultural colonies such as Rishon El Zion, Zikaron Yaakov, and later Peter Toikor and Rashpina. Some of these settlements were funded and protected by European philanthropic capital, notably Baron Edmund de Rothschild, Zionist institutions, the Jewish National Fund, 1901, early defense organizations like Hezimeh, founded 1909, began to project a modern national strategy that included land purchase, settlement, and the creation of agricultural and educational infrastructures. These were not mass movements at first, but they were coherent in their aims and increasingly anchored by European networks of capital and diplomatic support. At the same time, Palestinian Arab society was not static. It was urbanizing, literate, and politically awakening. Newspapers and printing presses beginning to flourish in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created a public sphere. By 1911, Palestine, founded in Jaffa, started giving voice to local political concerns and grievances. Municipal councils and sanitary boards altered the mechanics of local governance, and the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, with its promises of constitutional government, raised expectations and later anxieties when Istanbul pursued policies of centralization and Turkification. Social currents, migration from villages to new urban quarters, the growth of wage labor in ports and orchards, the appearance of male wage-earning class in towns created new constituencies and new ways of speaking about collective interest. Land laws, consular privileges, and the growth of export-oriented agriculture, particularly citrus cultivation centered on Jaffa, changed to controlled cash and who had mobility. The export economy required coordinated transport to ports, cold storage, and merchant houses, and it integrated parts of Palestine into the world market. It also created a class of Palestinians who profited from brokerage, land sales, and rental. At the same time, many rural cultivators faced pressures as land consolidated and as cash rents replaced more flexible traditional arrangements. By the eve of the First World War, the Ottoman imprint on Palestine was deep. The Wakan, the Ottoman legal corpus, the urban morphology shaped by Mamluki and Ottoman patronage, the administrative contours of Sanj Aks and Mutas era Fatates, the patchwork of religious communities with their respective hierarchies and privileges. But the empire's authority was strained. The Balkan Wars, the Young Turk turned to centralization, and the intensifying rivalries among European powers had hollowed parts of Ottoman sovereignty. In the military sphere, the logistics of modern warfare finally outgrew some traditional patterns. When the British-Egyptian Expeditionary Force under General Edmund Dale began its operations in southern Palestine in 1917, supply lines were oiled back to the Suez. Railheads and waterworks determined the pace of the campaign as much as the number of infantrymen. The capture of Beersheba, the southward flank moves, and the adventurous halt up the coastal plain were excesses in logistics and maneuver. The Ottoman garrisons, taxed by years of war and by the empire's stretched resources, could not sustain indefinite resistance. When British troops entered Jerusalem in December 1917, it was in many ways the logical conclusion of centuries of layered change. The city's capture, Allen's formal entry through Jaffa Gate on December 11th, after the surrender negotiated a few days earlier, was both tactical and theatrical. For generations, suzerains had sought to control the city, not merely because of its stones, but because of the symbolic claim its custody conferred across religious geographies. The politics of the 20th century would turn on those claims in new ways, but the scene Allenby encountered was one shaped by Crusader castles and Mammal madrasas, Ottoman walls and work registers, Turkish governors and European consul. The centuries of Crusader logistics and fortification of Ayyubid consolidation under Saladin, of Mamluk administrative resilience and architectural patronage, and of Ottoman reform. Railways and land codes had together transformed the soil. the seaport, the courts and the conversations of Palestine. The region that the British Army now took possession of was not an empty stage. It was a deeply worked landscape layered in law, in memory, in architecture, and in commerce, and it had been re-added in ways both intended and accidental for the furious politics that would come with modernity. In the late 90s, a new language of longing and politics took shape across Europe, and in salons and study halls whose conversations had been sharpened by the sharp edges of exile and discrimination. And that language, Zionism, would come to push and pull along, and that had long been a patchwork of villages, towns, and imperial outposts into a very different future. Theodor Herzl, with his 1896 pamphlet Day, Judenstaaten, the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, gave an organized international voice to a project that had already been gestating among Jews who fled pogroms in the Russian Empire, among ideological migrants from Central Europe, and among the precarious communities of Yemenite and North African Jews who had maintained a continuous presence in the towns and holy shrines. Ends of Ottoman Palestine. The early waves of immigration that began in the 1882 and continued in fits and starts into the 20th century were not monolithic. They brought farmers and craftsmen, dreamers and traders, socialists and devout Torah scholars. They brought capital and radical ideas about collective agriculture and new labor regimes. And they brought the revival of a language that had been largely lubrical into the street. Hebrew with ELEAs, Ba'Azia, Ben Yehuda, the most public of its midwives, coaxing syllables into markets and schools until the tongue itself became a civic instrument. There were practicalities to settlement and to nation building that were prosaic and enormous. Purchase deeds written in Ottoman registers, the digging of wells and the draining of swamps, the building of rail lines and the laying of telegraph, the organization of mutual aid societies and hospitals, the foundations of Tel Aviv and the Nine, like a small logic of modern urban planning rising out of orange groves outside Jaffa. Institutions followed the colonists. The World Zionist Organization, the Jewish National Fund in 1901, the Anglo-Jude philanthropic committees of Baron Edmund de Rothschild, the Jewish Agency, as it would later formalize representation. These bodies were instruments of terrain change as much as diplomacy, buying land, selling bonds, planning migration, and crucially defining who could be worked and who could be excluded under an ideology summed up in the phrase avoda, Hebrew labor, by insisting on Jewish labor and Jewish enterprises in Nicaea, but as the crucible of a new national character. Labor Zionists like David Ben Gurion and Burl Katz Insulin reshaped local economies. Histadrut, founded in 20, became not only a trade union, but carrier of social services and a major employer, knitting together health, insurance, freight and political lobbying in a way that magnified the YSHV's capacity to function as a proto-state. The Ottoman state that these developments tested had not been passive. Reforms over the 19th century, the Tanzimat, the 1858 Land Code, had altered property relations in the countryside, encouraging land registration and the rise of absentee proprietors for many cultivators. However, registering land meant exposure to taxes and conscription. Many avoided registration, and their customary rights could be swept aside when an urban or regional family, sometimes based in Beirut or Damascus, sold large tracts to outside buyers. The Soso-K family of Beirut is only the most cited example in English-language historiography of how the buying power of absentee and lords could in a single stroke of paperwork transform a field of peasant tenure into a registered sale to a Zionist organization. The Ottoman reaction to new settlement was multiple, at times bureaucratically permissive, at times suspicious, sometimes repressive. The late Ottoman period was also one of centralizing impulses. Young Turk modernization after 1908 demanded new loyalties and conscription. while imperial warrant collapse in 1914-18 would make the old arrangements brittle. Arab-Palestinian national consciousness rose alongside and in response to these changes, not as an instantaneous shout, but as a slow distillation of identity amid the political and social shocks of the late Ottoman Empire period. Local notables and religious leaders, urban intellectuals and rural families, Christian and Muslim alike, began to speak of Palestine not only as a place of shared daily life, but as a polity with rights. The Palestine Arab Congresses after World War I, the Muslim Christian associations in the towns, and a raft of newspapers and schools gave coherence to complaints about land loss, about the meaning of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and about the social dislocations produced by immigration and new labour regimes. The British had promised in different registers different things to Hussein in the MCM man correspondence to the French in Sykes-Picot to Zionist leaders in Balfour, and those contradictions produced a grinding friction when translated into policy under the mandate system established by the League of Nations in 1922. Within Palestinian Arab society, the politics of response were complex and uneven. There were moderates who sought legal recourse and petitioning in London and Geneva. There were radicals who turned to strikes and boycott, and there were leaders whose charisma came from religious as much as nationalist authority. H.A.J. Unlean Al-Hughes and I who emerged as Grand N.U.Y. of Jerusalem in the 1922 with British imprimatur, became a lightning rod for resistance and later a polarizing figure for historians. His role in the late 1930s and beyond is part of a larger chronicle of divergence between communal strategies. The 1922 and in 30s saw violence that transformed everyday relations. The N.U.B.I.M.U.S. riots in Jerusalem in 1920. The JAFF Ford disturbances of 1921. The Western Wall confrontations that escalated into the 29 disturbances, where he safety and elsewhere, were scenes of brutal communal rupture, followed by the long and coordinated Arab Revolt of 1936-1939, which combined general strike boycotts and armed ambushes against infrastructure. That revolt delivered a militarized British response. Tens of thousands of troops, counterinsurgency tactics, curfews and collective punishments, and a chain of commissions, Jean Peel, that tried to diagnose the impasse. The Peel Commission's 1937 recommendation to partition the land into two states with a proposal for population transfer was a signal that British administrators themselves were beginning to see the situation as irreconcilable without drastic measures. Logistics in these years mattered. The movement of people, of arms, of money, the railways and ports, the newly professionalized Jewish defense organizations that evolved from loosely coordinated settlements guards into Haganah in the 1920s and later into a fighting force with brigade, supply chains, and arms procurement. The irreverent militant, Iran, the even smaller, lay added volatility. On the Arab side, voluntary volunteers and the Arab Liberation Army were less centrally organized and had fewer secure lines of supply and training. Zionist diplomacy in London and Washington. Chaim Weizmann's patient lobbying the world's Zionist organizations' purchase mechanisms worked in tandem with a field apparatus that made use of migration flows, wartime refugee channels, and post-war displaced persons to swell the YHV's manpower and to supply cadres with military and administrative experience. Then came the British Mandate's twilight. The Second World War strained the imperial metropole and crystallized new political pressures. Holocaust survivors sought refuge. Zionist militias conducted illegal immigration and clandestine maritime transfer, and the British, fatigued and eager to preserve strategic relations with the Arab world, oscillated between facilitating and constraining Jewish immigration, culminating in the 39 White Paper's attempt to cap Jewish immigration and limit Jewish land purchases. That policy would be reversed into impotence by wartime realities and by the moral force of the Holocaust in the public imagination. And by the late 42nd, Britain would decide to hand the problem to the new international forum, the United Nations, when the UN General Assembly voted on 29th of November 1947 to petition the mandate into two states with an international zone for Jerusalem. The map that emerged was geometrically curious, fragmented parcels of territory, enclaves, and corridors designed to satisfy principle and practicality. The plan, Resolution 181, gave the proposed Jewish state a greater share of productive and coastal land than its population proportion suggested. Many Jewish leaders accepted the blueprint as a basis for realizing statehood, even if it fell short of earlier maxims of hope. Arab leaders in the Palestinian community rejected petition out of principle. Demographic realities and the mechanics of disposing they feared. Violence erupted immediately between the vote and the British withdrawal. The conflict morphed into civil war, militia encounters, blockading of roads, sieges of cities, and the planned operations of both sides to secure essential arteries for food and reinforcements. The military choreography of 1947-48 was a hybrid of planned campaigns and improvisation. Haganah, increasingly professional and centralized, issued PL, let in March 1948, interpreted variously by historians as a blueprint for orderly control or as a directive for wider territorial consolidation, and senior commanders operated with a clear objective: to secure communications to Jerusalem, to create contiguous Jewish territory, and to defend settlements under threat. Operations such as Naxhon in April 1948 sought to open the road to Jerusalem, and later Operations Dani in July at Lidnd Ramle. Yovand Haram in October in the south and north altered the map on the ground with swift maneuvers and sometimes brutal displacement. GG on Unlehi carried out spectacular assaults too, most infamously the attack on Diest in April 48, which had an outsized effect on the psychology of Palestinians, civilians and fighters alike. On the other side, Arab irregulars, volunteers of the Arab Liberation Army, and after May 15th, when neighboring Arab states intervened, regular forces from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq attacked along multiple fronts. The Jordanian Arab Legion under Gub Paz-Herand, commanded by officers with British training, was the most effective Arab military force and secured the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Disunity, among the Arab capitals, political rivalries, different strategic aims and disagreements about control meant that their combined effort lacked the concentrated coordination of an integrated campaign. When the British mandate ended and David Bain, Jurian proclaimed the State of Israel on the 14th of May 1948, the moment was at once culmination and beginning. Armies streamed in, cities changed hands, and populations flowed in panic, coercion, or under orders. The Palestinian Naj-EBA. The catastrophe was a demographic rupture on a scale that reshaped the Levant. Roughly 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled to camps in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, where makeshift tents and UNRWA's not-entry-relief efforts would stitch a refugee problem into a permanent fixture of regional politics. Hundreds of villages were depopulated, and many were later razed or repopulated with new arrivals. On the flip side, large numbers of Jews in Arab countries facing insecurity, legal discrimination, and at times expulsion migrated to the new state of Israel, often under organized operations. Yemenite Jews flew out in Operation Magic Carpet, and Iraqi Jews were airlifted in subsequent years. The regional demographic balance had been transformed into an intractable political puzzle and a humanitarian emergence. On my SD agreements in 49 signed, separately with Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria concretized either military results rather than resolving the political dispute. The Green Line, a collection of armistice lines rather than an internationally recognized border, left Israel in control of much of the area allocated to the Jewish state under the UN plan and more. Besides, Jordan held the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt administrated the Gaza Strip without annexing it, and the territories of the former mandate were partitioned in a way that left refugees beyond any durable settlement of citizenship or property. UN Resolution 194 had urged the right of return and compensation for refugees. The resolution's appeal would resound in decades of negotiation and objection and would be a core grievance for Palestinians. Internally, Israel institutionalized the wartime gains and the losses of the Palestinian population with legal instruments, such as the Absentees Property Law of 1950, which transferred property rights of departure, creating a legal and administrative scaffolding that made restitution difficult. The decades after 1948 were not a settling, but a compression, unresolved displacement, state formation, regional competition. The Palestine question migrated from relief camps into guerrilla bases. The Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in for under the aegis of the Arab League and initially chaired by Ahmed Shukr, became the umbrella for factions and guerrilla movements. Fatah led by Yasser Arafat, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine with George Habash and others who sought to internationalize the Palestinian cause through both armed struggle and diplomacy. Their headquarters shifted as geopolitics demanded to Jordan, then to Lebanon, where the PLO's presence catalyzed a destabilizing spiral culminating in the Israeli invasion of 1980 to in the PLO's evacuation to Tunis. A decisive logistical and strategic pivot came in June and December. After weeks of rising tension, Egypt's closure of the Straits of Tyran in May, the expulsion of UNEF peacekeepers, a military build-up on Israel's borders, and a series of Arab proclamations of hostility, Israel launched a preemptive air campaign that destroyed much of the Egyptian and Syrian air forces on the ground. In 6 days, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golden Heights from Syria. The scale was breathtaking and immediate. Tens of thousands of soldiers moved on multiple fronts, armored columns and paratroopers, seizing strategic heights and road junctions, artillery and air power consolidating gains. The result was a new reality of occupation. Israel now controlled territories with large Palestinian populations, and the administrative and military challenges of governing hundreds of thousands of people in densely built towns and refugee camps produced an occupation regime that combined military orders, civil administration, and the slow accretion of policy decisions that would just shape near daily life for generations. Settlements which had been a feature of pre-67's IANA strategy in certain zones like Guset Yom became a deliberate policy till after the war. The state built roads, water infrastructure and security enclaves that made settlements functionally integrated with Israel proper. Even when located deep inside the West Bank, these projects required labor, concrete pipes, military escorts, an industry of occupation that altered land use, restricted movement, and created mosaic patterns of control. Throughout the 1972 and especially after the 77 electoral victory of Man Akim begins liquid settlement construction accelerated, driven both by ideological movements such as Gush Minimum and by state ministries that provided incentives and subsidies. The geography of the West Bank was thus reshaped by a network of settlements by pass roads and checkpoints that were part military cordon, part civilian infrastructure. Resistance took multiple forms. The PLO and its affiliate organizations carried out cross-BE raids, underline hijackings that internationalized the struggle. Palestinian-fed operations from Lebanon and elsewhere brought repeated Israeli retaliations inside the territories. Frustration with occupation boiled over in December 1987. what became the first Intifada. It began in the refugee camps and the streets of Gaza and spread like a contagion of civil disobedience. Stone throwing, strikes, boycotts, and grassroots organizing by neighborhood and village committees that coordinated curfews, tax strikes, and alternative social services. Israel answered with force, curfews, mass arrests, administrative detention, army patrols, but the Intifada was also a political earthquake. It exposed the cost of occupation to both the occupier and the occupied in a way that made diplomacy possible where it had seemed impossible before. Those negotiations took a surprising and secret turn in Oslo in 1993. Back channels between Israel and elements of the PLO led to the Declaration of Principles signed on the 13th of September 1993, in which mutual recognition was exchanged and the outline of a phased Palestinian Authority emerged to administer parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The Oslo process, Oslo I and later Oslo II, created a framework of partial self, minus government areas A, B and C in the West Bank, security coordination, and a timetable for final status talks. Yet the architecture left many core issues to be resolved later. Jerusalem status, refugees' right of return, borders and settlements, water rights and security arrangements. Settlement expansion continued through the 90s and domestic opposition within Israel hardened in certain quarters. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 by an Israeli extremist dismissed the fragile optimism of the peace process with a brutal punctuation. The peace architecture frayed under the weight of unmet expectations and new cycles of violence. The visit of Ariel Sharon to the Haram el-Sharif from Temple Mount in September 2000 touched off the second Intifada, a far more militarized clash than the previous uprising. Suicide bombings in Israeli cities. Intensive Israeli counterinsurgency operations, including targeted assassinations, incursions into West Bank towns, and Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. Reshaped the landscape once again. Israel built a separation barrier, a physical and legal line whose route would later be judged illegal, where it diverged from the Green Line by the International Court of Justice in a 2004 advisory opinion, but which Israel defended as a necessary security measure that reduced attacks. The Intifada's human toll was heavy on both sides, and the economic and institutional infrastructures of Palestinian society were severely damaged. Gaza's trajectory after Oslo was in some ways a microcosm of the larger dilemmas. Israel's unilateral disengagement in 2005 removed settlers and soldiers from inside Gaza, but left control over airspace, maritime access, and most of the crossings in Israeli hands. The 2006 electoral victory of Hamas, its violent takeover in 2007, and the subsequent blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt turned Gaza into a high-density enclave under severe constraint punctuated by periodic wars 2008-9. 20,122,014 among the larger conflicts since the Oslo era, with devastating humanitarian consequences for a population living under blockade and repeated bombardment. Rocket fire into Israeli towns, tunnel infiltration attempts, naval skirmishes, and asymmetric warfare became the mode of engagement, and the civil war inside Palestinian politics, Fatah versus Hamas, created a division of authority that continues to paralyze coherent national strategy. Throughout this long century of contestation, the international legal and diplomatic frameworks have been both tools and battlegrounds. The UN debates Security Council resolutions such as 240 to after the Mad War with its call for withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict in exchange for recognition and peace. The ICJ's advisory opinion on the wall and more recent investigations at the International Criminal Court. All these have tried to adjudicate responsibilities and to clarify obligations under humanitarian and human rights law. Many states and international bodies consistently view Israeli settlements as illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel disputes that reading, arguing legal and historical claims, security necessities, or that the territories are disputed rather than occupied in the classical sense. Refugee law has proved especially naughty. UNRWA's definition of Palestinian refugee, which extends to descendants, creates a legal and humanitarian record of displacement that keeps the issue alive in ways that other refugee situations absorbed by national citizenship regimes do not. The contemporary reality is a landscape of layered control and fragmented sovereignty. A Palestinian Authority with limited autonomy hamstrung by official dependence, restricted movement and political division. A Gaza Strip under blockade and periodic conflict-resolution. A West Bank dissected by checkpoints, settlements, enclaves, and areas A and C that create a patchwork of governance. East Jerusalem, under Israeli municipal control with residents holding complex status and a refugee problem that remains unresolved and politically explosive. Humanitarian crisis, water scarcity, crumbling health systems, unemployment and food insecurity sit beside elaborate security architectures, radar, drones, fortifications and intelligence networks. Internal Palestinian politics with Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Banks at negotiating leverage. Israeli politics often shaped by coalition arithmetic and a strong settler lobby complicate the prospects for territorial compromise. At the same time, regional realignments, Arab states normalizing relations with Israel in various accords, have changed the incentives of some capitals, but have not translated into a comprehensive resolution of the Palestinian claim. What has been striking across more than a century is the persistence of structural contradictions, competing claims of national self minus determination, the geopolitics of weak empires giving way to stronger states with their own priorities, the logistics of movement, water, settlement and security creating facts on the ground that outstrip diplomatic blueprints, the human realities of refugees and demography that make simple solutions impossible. International interventions have been partial and often self-contradictory. Local leaders have sometimes sacrificed long-term possibilities for short-term survival. Each cycle of negotiation produces its own administrative and legal scaffolding, agreements, ordinances, municipal boundaries that then become obstacles to subsequent compromise, because they are by then the everyday scaffolding of homes and lives. So the conflict continues as a ledger of strategic choices and logistical apparatuses, a map of roads and settlement blocks, a refugee camps and military checkpoints, a diplomatic declarations and legal challenges, each move creating new material constraints and political psychology to speak in biblical cadence. The ground he remembers what was planted and what was uprooted. It stores the memory of treaties and expulsions, of hospitals and checkpoints. The human noise is immense, but the historian's task is to hold the machinery of events in focus, where the trains ran, how the bridges were built or blown, how the armed shipments crossed borders, how the bureaucracies registered land and citizenship, and how the international system voted and debated. The problems that must be solved before peace can become durable are as much administrative and logistical as they are moral and legal. How to create contiguous sovereign territory for Palestinians, how to address claims of return and restitution without undermining democratic and security assumptions on the other side, how to dismantle exclusionary infrastructure while guaranteeing basic safety, and how to translate a century of grievance into institutions that distribute rights rather than rents. In the end, the map remains a contested ledger. The choices that produced it, the purchase deeds under Ottoman law, the clandestine land acquisitions of the Mandate period, the British White Papers and the UN partition, the military campaigns of 1948 and 1967, the settlement roads and the barrier, The Oslo Accords and their partial implementations are not merely historical episodes. They are the scaffolding of the present. We can name the corridors and the checkpoints. We can chart the armies and the committees. We can list the commissions and the treaties. But the quiet persistence of the problem lies in the fact that each technological or legal fix creates its own human geography that then has to be respected or undone. The diplomacy that hopes to disentangle the threads must be as pragmatic about water pipes and border crossings as it is principled about rights. That is the logistical truth behind the rhetoric. It is a long story and it is not finished. The archives are full. The maps keep changing. New generations wake up with inherited boundaries and inherited grievances. The most immediate tasks: stabilizing humanitarian conditions, restoring meaningful governance in Gaza, arresting the centrifugal drift of the West Bank and creating a negotiation framework that can address refugees, Jerusalem, and security in an integrated way require attention to detail, crossing points that work, municipal responsibilities that are guaranteed, legal formulas that allow dignity without demographic annihilation of either side. These are the unglamorous nocturnal labors of peacemaking. The engineers, the lawyers, the municipal planners, the agricultural economists, the water engineers, the social workers will have to draft the appendices to any future agreement as rigorously as soldiers once drew up operational plans. If history has taught anything, it is that strategy without logistics is a dream, and logistics without justice is a rebellion. The challenge is to find at last a choreography that can hold both. Listen then to the long shuttling of months and years, to the meticulous arithmetic of maps and laws and migrations, to the way in which empires and diasporas have debated and bargained over this narrow strip of land, and hold in mind that behind every headline there are roads to pave and permits to issue, water reservoirs to share, and cemeteries to honor. The story of Palestine has been and remains a story of national dreams colliding with imperial strategies and the slow, difficult work of making governance match the needs of people. It is a tale of institutions born in farmhouses and of armies formed in back alleys, of legal opinions and refugee camps, of underground rail cars and municipal archives. Perhaps it is the greatest of ironies that what began with aspirations to return somehow turned into a century of displacements and administrative complexity that now itself will have to be undone by the same patient instruments, law engineering, and the careful labor of agreement.